In 1990, Donald Trump owed $900 million, not his companies, him personally. $900 million in personal debt that he had guaranteed on properties that were now worth less than what he owed on them. The banks were circling, the press was writing his obituary, his casinos were hemorrhaging cash, his airline had already collapsed, his marriage was falling apart publicly in the tabloids, and the man who had spent the entire previous decade telling anyone who would listen that he was the greatest dealmaker in New York had nothing left to deal with. A financial analyst at the time calculated that a homeless man on the street had a higher net worth than Donald Trump. Because zero is greater than negative 900 million. The press loved it. Business writers who had spent years being forced to take his calls, sit through his lunches, endure his self-promotion, were finally able to write what they had always suspected, that it was all theater, that the empire was built on borrowed money and borrowed time, that the man behind the gold-plated lobbies and the helicopter and the constant stream of magazine covers was, at the most fundamental financial level, a fraud. That was 1990. By 2004, he had a #1 rated television show and was one of the most recognizable business personalities on earth. By 2015, he had a brand valued at hundreds of millions of dollars. By 2024, his media company alone was valued at billions. The press that wrote his obituary in 1990 spent the next 3 decades trying to explain how someone who should have been finished kept not being finished. Machiavelli could have explained it. In 1513. Before any of it happened. Because what Trump did between 1990 and every comeback that followed is not mysterious if you have read The Prince carefully. It is not luck. It is not simply force of personality, although the personality is real. It is a specific set of strategic moves that Machiavelli identified as the mechanics of how power is recovered after it has been lost. Moves that almost nobody makes because almost nobody has the stomach for them. Moves that look like recklessness from the outside and read like Chapter 3 of The Prince from the inside. That is what this video is. A precise, documented, honest analysis of how one of the most public business comebacks in modern history maps onto a strategy written 500 years ago. Not a political video. Not a celebration. Not a condemnation. A strategy analysis. Because the principles that explain Trump's business trajectory are the same principles that explain every significant accumulation of power and recovery of power across 5 centuries of history. And understanding them is one of the most practically useful things you can do for your own financial and professional life. The Prince explains the comeback. Trump lived it. And this video shows you exactly where the two connect. Before we go further, if you are someone who wants to understand how power actually moves, rather than how you were told it moves, subscribe right now. This channel exists for exactly that conversation. The honest mechanics, the real analysis. The stuff nobody packages cleanly because it does not fit the version of the world most people are comfortable with. Subscribe, and let's get into it. Let's start with the move that nobody saw coming, and that Machiavelli would have identified immediately as the most important strategic decision Trump made in the entire 1990 crisis. He did not disappear. This sounds obvious until you understand what it actually cost him to stay visible. In 1990 and 1991, while his debt was being restructured, while banks were negotiating with him over what they were going to get back, while the tabloids were running daily updates on the collapse, Trump continued to show up. He gave interviews. He showed his face at events. He talked about what he was going to build next. He did all of this while owing $900 million personally, and with creditors who could have called in those loans at any moment. Every advisor he had told him to go quiet, to stop talking, to let the situation resolve itself without the ongoing spectacle of the man at the center of the disaster continuing to act as if he was still at the top of the game. He ignored all of it. Machiavelli wrote in Chapter 21 that nothing makes a prince so highly esteemed as great enterprises and the demonstration of his personal qualities. He wrote specifically that the prince who disappears in difficulty loses twice. He loses the battle, and he loses the perception of himself as someone capable of winning battles. And in the world of power, Machiavelli observed, the perception of capability is often more important than the capability itself. The prince who is perceived as finished is finished whether or not he actually is. Trump understood this instinctively or strategically, or both. The moment you accept the narrative that you are done, you have handed that narrative to the people who are writing it. And the people writing it in 1990 were the same financial press that had covered his rise, with a mixture of fascination and barely concealed condescension. They were not neutral observers. They had a preferred outcome to the story, and the preferred outcome was that the gaudy, loud, self-promoting developer from Queens who had crashed the establishment's party for a decade was finally getting what they had always suspected he deserved. By staying visible, by continuing to project confidence in public while his lawyers negotiated privately, Trump was denying them the ending they wanted. Not because he was not in trouble. He was in extraordinary trouble, but because Machiavelli's principle held. The prince who continues to demonstrate his qualities even in defeat forces observers to keep updating their assessment of whether the defeat is permanent. Banks noticed this. And here is the part of the 1990 debt restructuring story that almost never gets told honestly in the coverage of Trump's financial history. The banks chose not to foreclose. They had every legal right to do so. The loans were in default or near default. The collateral was insufficient. By the pure logic of banking, the correct move was to seize the assets, liquidate what they could, and write off the rest. They restructured instead. Why? Not because they were being generous. Banks are not in the business of generosity. They restructured because they made a calculated assessment that a Trump-branded property managed by Trump was worth more than the same property managed by a bank receiver. His name had become the asset. The buildings were collateral. The brand was the actual value, and the brand only existed as long as Trump remained publicly viable. Machiavelli wrote that the prince who makes himself indispensable to those who have the power to destroy him has found the most durable form of protection available. Not walls. Not armies. Indispensability, the moment the banks understood that their recovery depended on his survival. Their interest and his interest became the same interest. And parties with aligned interests do not foreclose on each other. That was the first Machiavellian move, staying visible to protect the perception, and the perception protecting the brand, and the brand protecting the debt restructuring. The whole chain running from a principle written in 1513 applied to a crisis in 1990 that should have ended everything. It did not end anything. It built the foundation for everything that came after. Now let's talk about the move that built the recovery. Because staying visible was the defensive play. What Trump did next was the offensive one. And it is the move that Machiavelli describes in Chapter 6 as the defining characteristic of the prince who builds something lasting rather than something temporary. He changed the battlefield. In the 1980s, Trump's empire was real estate, physical buildings, casinos, hotels, properties that required enormous capital, generated enormous debt, and were subject to the full force of economic cycles in ways that he could not control. When the real estate market turned in the late 1980s, his entire operating model collapsed simultaneously because all of his assets were in the same category, responding to the same conditions. In the 1990s, Trump made a strategic decision that most people missed at the time, and that almost nobody frames correctly even now. He started building a different kind of asset, not a physical one, a conceptual one. He started building Trump as an idea rather than Trump as a collection of buildings. The licensing model was the mechanism. Instead of owning properties outright, he started putting his name on properties owned by other people. He took a fee, sometimes cash, sometimes equity, for the use of the Trump brand on someone else's building, someone else's golf course, someone else's hotel development. His capital exposure went to near zero, his brand exposure went to maximum, and the brand, which the banks had accidentally taught him was the actual asset, started generating revenue that required no debt, because it required no construction. Machiavelli wrote that the prince who has learned from defeat to avoid the conditions that produced the defeat, and who redirects his strength to territory where his capability cannot be similarly undermined, is the prince who recovers rather than collapses. The lesson of a lost battle is not about the battle. It is about the terrain, and the prince who insists on fighting the same kind of battle that destroyed him has not learned the lesson. Trump learned the lesson. The terrain that destroyed him was physical real estate, requiring borrowed capital in a cyclical market. The terrain he moved to was brand licensing, requiring almost no capital in a market that ran on perception rather than economic cycles. The same name that had cost him in one terrain became the primary asset in the other. By the mid-1990s, he was earning significant fees simply for allowing developers to put his name on their projects. The buildings could fail, the casinos could continue to struggle. None of it affected the licensing income, because the licensing income was not tied to the performance of the underlying properties. It was tied to the perception of the Trump name. And he was now spending all of his remaining energy managing that perception rather than managing the properties. Machiavelli would have called this the recovery of virtue. Not moral virtue, strategic virtue. The capacity to identify what actually works in your specific situation and redirect your full capability toward it, rather than persisting with what worked before the situation changed. Now let's talk about the specific Machiavellian principle that explains something almost everyone gets wrong about Trump's negotiation style. The thing that business journalists spent decades describing as erratic, unpredictable, and counterproductive. The thing his critics pointed to as evidence that he was not a serious businessman. The thing that Machiavelli identified in Chapter 17 as one of the most reliable tools available to the prince, who wants to control the terms of every engagement. Deliberate unpredictability. Machiavelli wrote that the prince who is fully known, fully predictable, fully legible to his opponents, has already surrendered the most important strategic advantage available to him, because the opponent who knows exactly what you will do can prepare for exactly what you will do. The opponent who cannot predict what you will do is always slightly off balance, always in a reactive position, always committing resources to scenarios that may not materialize. Trump's negotiation style, across 4 decades of documented deals, follows a pattern that looks chaotic from outside and reads as calculated from inside the prince. He opens with positions that are extreme enough to be almost insulting. He makes demands that the other party considers non-negotiable. He walks away from deals that appear to be almost complete. He publicly criticizes counterparties while privately continuing to negotiate with them. He changes his position rapidly and without apparent reason. He uses the media as a negotiating tool, leaking information or letting rumors run that change the psychological state of the person across the table from him. Every one of those behaviors makes perfect sense through the lens of Chapter 17. The extreme opening position is not a real position, it is an anchor. Psychological research on negotiation consistently shows that the first number stated in a negotiation has a disproportionate effect on the final number agreed. By opening at an extreme, Trump was setting an anchor that pulled the final outcome toward his position, even when he eventually moved significantly from his opening. The public walk away is a power signal. It communicates that he has alternatives. The counterparty who believes the other person has no alternatives negotiates from a position of strength. The counterparty who believes the other person can and will walk away negotiates from a position of anxiety. Anxiety produces concessions. Machiavelli wrote that the prince who never demonstrates that he can leave is the prince who will always be forced to stay on whatever terms the other party dictates. The media use is Chapter 21 applied to negotiation specifically. By making the deal public, by letting the counterparty's position be known, by creating an audience for the negotiation, Trump was adding a dimension of reputational pressure to what would otherwise be a purely financial calculation. A party that is only calculating financially asks, what does this cost me in money? A party that is calculating financially and reputationally asks, what does this cost me in money, and how does it look if I lose to this man publicly? The reputational dimension almost always produces a more favorable outcome for the person who created it. His critics read all of this as a character problem. Machiavelli reads it as a methodology. And the methodology, applied across 40 years of documented transactions, produced an outcome that most of the people who criticized the methodology never came close to matching. Now let's talk about the single most important Machiavellian principle in Trump's entire business trajectory. The one that explains not just how he recovered from the 1990 crisis, but how he turned that recovery into something that generated more power than the original empire had. Machiavelli wrote in Chapter 18 something that people quote out of context so often that its actual meaning has been almost completely buried under the misuse. He wrote that it is necessary for the prince to know well how to use both the beast and the man, the lion and the fox, force and cunning, power and perception. But the deeper insight in that chapter is what Machiavelli writes about the relationship between reputation and reality, He wrote that everyone sees what you appear to be, few experience what you really are. And in the actions of all men, especially princes, where there is no court of appeal, one judges by the result. Read that last line again. One judges by the result. Not by the method, not by the process, not by how it was achieved or what compromises were made along the way, or what the person was like privately, or what their actual financial position was at any given point. By the result. The visible, tangible, undeniable result. Trump understood this with a clarity that his competitors never fully grasped. The result that mattered was not the bottom line of any individual property or the debt-to-equity ratio of his balance sheet, or any of the financial metrics that his critics used to argue that he was not actually as successful as he claimed. The result that mattered was the brand, the public perception, the name that people recognized, the image of success that was so thoroughly constructed and so relentlessly maintained that it became indistinguishable from the reality in the minds of the people who mattered for his specific purposes. The Art of the Deal, published in 1987, is not primarily a book about real estate. It is a perception management document. It is Trump telling the world a specific story about who he is and how he operates, and doing so with sufficient detail, confidence, and narrative craft that the story becomes the accepted version of reality for millions of readers. Machiavelli would have recognized it immediately. The prince does not wait for others to tell his story. The prince who allows others to narrate his life will find that the narrative serves their interests rather than his. The prince who narrates his own life sets the terms on which he is evaluated. By the time the 1990 crisis hit, the story of Trump as master dealmaker was so thoroughly embedded in public consciousness that even the crisis could not fully dislodge it. The banks who were restructuring his debt were doing so in the context of that story. The press who were writing his obituary were writing it as a fall from a height that the story had established. And Trump himself was navigating the crisis with the confidence of a man who had already decided what the next chapter of the story was going to say. Machiavelli wrote that the prince who controls the story controls the future, because the story is what attracts the next opportunity, the next alliance, the next investment. The story is what makes people pick up the phone when you call. The story is what makes banks restructure rather than foreclose. The story is what makes a television network give a bankrupt developer a show about business, because the character the show needed already existed, and the public already believed in it. The Apprentice premiered in January 2004. By that point, Trump had been through multiple bankruptcy filings, had restructured hundreds of millions in debt, had sold assets he swore he would never sell, and had rebuilt on a model radically different from the one that had collapsed. None of that was visible to the millions of viewers who tuned in to watch Donald Trump say "you are fired" to aspiring executives. What they saw was the story, the boardroom, the gold, the authority, the name on the building, the complete and seamless presentation of a man who had always been exactly this successful and always would be. Machiavelli's principle from Chapter 18 made visible in prime time. Everyone sees what you appear to be. One judges by the result. The result was a #1 show, a brand that reached into households that had never followed real estate news or business journalism, a television platform that transformed a name known primarily in New York business circles into a globally recognized brand. And all of it built on a story that Trump had been writing since the Art of the Deal, a story that the 1990 crisis had threatened but not broken because he had refused to let it be broken. Because he had stayed visible, changed the battlefield, controlled the narrative, and waited for the moment when the perception could be converted back into power. Trump did not become smaller in the crisis, he became more concentrated. Everything that the crisis stripped away, the buildings, the debt, the complicated financial structure, the physical empire that had been built on borrowed money, all of it was replaced by the one thing the crisis could not touch. The name. The story. The idea of Trump as a category of success rather than a collection of assets. Machiavelli would have said that the prince who loses everything except his name has lost nothing essential. Because everything can be rebuilt from a name. And nothing can be built without one. Now let's talk about the name on the building. Because this is the detail that Trump's critics spent decades using as evidence of ego. The gold letters, the Trump on every tower, every casino, every golf course, every hotel. the relentless, unapologetic, shameless plastering of his own name across every physical surface his money had touched. Business journalists wrote about it with barely concealed contempt. Architects complained about it. Competitors found it vulgar. The establishment real estate world regarded it as the clearest possible signal that this man was not one of them and never would be. Machiavelli would have regarded it as one of the smartest things he ever did. Chapter 21 of The Prince returns to a theme Machiavelli never stops pressing. The prince must make himself visible. Not occasionally, constantly, not subtly, unmistakably. He wrote that the prince who allows his presence to be ambiguous, who blends into the landscape, who does not force the world to continually reckon with his existence, is the prince who will be forgotten in the calculation of power the moment a more visible alternative appears. The name on the building was not ego in the way his critics meant it. It was infrastructure. Every person who walked past Trump Tower, every guest who stayed at a Trump hotel, every golfer who played a Trump course, every television viewer who watched The Apprentice was having the same neurological experience. The name was being written into their memory with the associated image of success, luxury, power, authority, not because they chose to learn it, because it was impossible to avoid. When the crisis hit in 1990 and the banks were deciding what to do about $900 million in personal debt, they were not making that decision in a vacuum. They were making it about a man whose name was on some of the most prominent real estate in New York. The name was not separable from the value of the assets. The name was part of what the assets were worth. Removing the name, which foreclosure would effectively have done, would have reduced the value of the properties they were trying to recover. The infrastructure of the brand protected the man who built it in exactly the moment when everything else had failed. Machiavelli wrote that the prince who is known to all cannot be easily destroyed because his destruction requires everyone who knows him to update their understanding of the world. And that cognitive load, the effort required to revise a widely held belief, is itself a form of protection. The more people who have been made to reckon with your existence, the more effort it costs to make them stop reckoning with it. Trump built that protection one gold letter at a time across 3 decades before the crisis, and the crisis proved the protection worked. Now let's talk about the principle that explains something even more specific about how Trump operated that almost no analysis of his career gets right: his response to disrespect. This is the thing that most observers read as thin skin. The sensitivity to insults, the willingness to respond to criticism with disproportionate force, the refusal to let perceived slights go unanswered, the decades-long feuds with people who had said something unflattering in a magazine profile, the responses at 2 a.m. to people with 50 followers who had said something he did not like. His critics read all of that as a character weakness, a psychological fragility, evidence that beneath the bravado was someone who could not tolerate honest assessment. Machiavelli read it differently, and chapter 19 of The Prince is where he makes the argument that reframes the entire behavior. He wrote that the prince has 2 things to fear above all others: internal conspiracy and external attack, and he noted that the most reliable source of internal conspiracy is contempt. The prince who allows himself to be treated with contempt, who absorbs disrespect without response, who lets it be known that his tolerance for dismissal is unlimited, is the prince who invites the people around him to stop taking him seriously. And the people who stop taking you seriously start calculating whether the cost of opposing you is lower than the cost of continuing to accommodate you. Every time Trump responded to a perceived slight with disproportionate force, he was sending the same signal. There is no free shot here. Every attack will be met with a response that costs the attacker more than the attack cost me. The calculation for anyone considering a public attack on Trump included not just the argument they wanted to make, but the certainty of the counterattack and the energy they would have to spend managing it. Over time, that signal accumulated into what Machiavelli would have called a reputation for ferocity. Not physical ferocity, reputational ferocity. The widely understood knowledge that engaging with Trump in combat, public or private, was a significantly more expensive proposition than engaging with almost any of his competitors, because his competitors absorbed criticism professionally and moved on. Trump absorbed nothing and moved sideways into your lane with everything he had. The practical effect of this reputation was that a significant percentage of the criticism and opposition that would normally have accumulated around a figure with his level of public exposure simply did not materialize, because the people who might have generated it ran a cost-benefit analysis and decided the return was not worth the engagement. Machiavelli wrote that the prince who makes opposition expensive does not need to eliminate opposition. He needs only to make the price high enough that most people choose not to pay it. The thin skin was not a vulnerability. It was a deterrent. Now let's talk about the move that Trump made that none of his competitors made, and that explains why his name survived the 1990s when theirs did not. Trump was not the only big developer who went into financial crisis in that period. The real estate collapse of the late 1980s and early 1990s hit every major developer in the market. Several of them had profiles and reputations and assets that were comparable to Trump's at the peak. Several of them went through their own debt restructurings and their own periods of severe financial distress. Almost none of them recovered at the same scale. Almost none of them are household names today. What did Trump do that they did not do? Machiavelli's answer is in Chapter 6. He wrote about the difference between what he called armed prophets and unarmed prophets. The armed prophet is the one who has built something that survives him in the minds of others. The unarmed prophet is the one whose following, whose reputation, whose influence depends entirely on his continued personal presence and performance. The armed prophet's position survives setbacks because the idea has become independent of the circumstances. The unarmed prophet's position collapses the moment the circumstances turn against him, because there is nothing holding it up except the circumstances. Trump's competitors were unarmed prophets. Their value was entirely tied to their current financial position. When the financial position collapsed, the value collapsed with it. There was no independent asset that survived the collapse. No brand that continued to carry weight after the balance sheet deteriorated. No story that people continued to believe after the building stopped performing. Trump was an armed prophet. The brand had become independent of any individual property or any current financial position. The name carried weight that was not tied to the current performance of the assets that bore it. When the building struggled, the name did not struggle at the same rate. When the casinos filed for bankruptcy, the brand survived because the brand was not the casinos. It was the idea of Trump. And the idea had been so thoroughly constructed, so relentlessly maintained, so deeply embedded in public consciousness, that it had achieved the kind of independence from circumstance that Machiavelli described as the only truly durable foundation. Armed prophets endure. Unarmed prophets disappear when the conditions that supported them change. The 1990 crisis was the moment that revealed which category Trump occupied, and the answer it revealed is the reason this video exists. Because the category was not accidental. It was built. Deliberately, over years, using principles that Machiavelli had identified as the mechanics of durable power 5 centuries before a developer from Queens applied them to the Manhattan real estate market. Now let's talk about the Machiavellian principle that connects everything we have covered and that is the most directly applicable to your own financial and professional life. Machiavelli wrote in Chapter 25 about what he called the power of fortune and the importance of preparation for its reversals. He wrote that fortune favors the bold, not recklessly bold, strategically bold. The prince who responds to reversal with energy rather than paralysis, who treats crisis as the moment to move rather than the moment to wait, who understands that the terrain is most open to reshaping immediately after a disruption, that prince has an advantage that the cautious man can never access. Trump's response to the 1990 crisis was not cautious. A cautious man would have retreated, reduced his profile, managed the situation quietly, and hoped to emerge eventually with something left. A cautious man would have protected what remained, rather than projecting what could be rebuilt. Trump projected. Immediately and continuously, he talked about what he was going to build while he was still negotiating about what he owed. He described his future while his present was being restructured by committees of bankers. He behaved like a man who had already decided what the next chapter said, while everyone around him was writing the obituary of the current one. Fortune does not favor the bold because of mysticism. It favors the bold because boldness is a signal that changes how the people around you respond to you. And how the people around you respond to you is the largest single determinant of whether your crisis becomes a permanent condition or a temporary one. Now here is the part that makes everything we have covered actually useful to you. The first principle was staying visible in the crisis. The refusal to disappear when the social pressure to disappear was at its maximum. At your scale, this means holding the distinction between your current position and the permanent one you have decided to build toward. Those are two different things, and most people treat them as the same thing. The current position is what is true right now. The permanent one is what you decide to build toward, regardless of what is true right now. And the man who can hold that distinction clearly, who can acknowledge the current reality without accepting it as the ceiling, is the man who is capable of the kind of sustained effort that eventually changes the current reality into something different. The job that ended, the business that failed, the financial decision that went wrong, the reputation that took a hit. All of those things are current positions. None of them are permanent ones unless you treat them as permanent. And the moment you treat them as permanent, you have done the one thing that Machiavelli identified as the prince's only truly fatal error. You have accepted the world's assessment of your position as the final word. Decide on the permanent position. Then start working the gap. That is the whole instruction. The second principle was changing the battlefield. The recognition that the terrain that destroyed you is not the only terrain available. Most people miss this completely because changing the battlefield requires admitting that the current one is not working. And admitting that feels like giving up. Machiavelli's response is direct. He wrote that the prince who persists in methods that have already failed him out of pride or stubbornness is not demonstrating loyalty to his vision. He is demonstrating an inability to distinguish between the vision and the vehicle he chose to pursue it with. The vision may be sound, the vehicle may be wrong. The vision is the outcome you are moving toward. The vehicle is the specific method, career, business model, or approach you are currently using to get there. They are not the same thing. And when the vehicle is not working, changing the vehicle is not abandoning the vision, it is protecting it. Identify what is not working. Then ask the more useful question. What terrain do I actually have access to right now, where my specific capabilities give me a genuine advantage? Not the terrain that looks most prestigious, the terrain where what you know, what you can do, and what you have access to right now creates a real edge. The third principle was the negotiation methodology, the deliberate unpredictability, the extreme opening position, the public walk away. At your scale, this applies to every significant negotiation in your financial and professional life. Your salary, your rates, your terms with suppliers or clients or partners. Most men negotiate badly, not because they lack information, but because they negotiate from the wrong psychological position. They negotiate as people who need the outcome. And the person who needs the outcome always negotiates at a disadvantage to the person who wants the outcome, but has demonstrated a genuine willingness to not have it. The walk away is the most powerful negotiating position available, and it is only available to the person who has built enough alternatives that walking away from this particular outcome does not represent a crisis. Build the alternatives first, then negotiate from the position they create. That sequence is the whole strategy. The fourth principle was the brand, the name on the building. At your scale, the brand is your reputation. What people think of when someone mentions you in a room you are not in. What they say about your work, your reliability, your capability, your character. When the only audience is the other people in the conversation. That reputation is being built right now, whether you are building it deliberately or not. Every interaction, every piece of work, every commitment kept or broken, all of it accumulating into a brand that exists in the minds of the people whose opinions matter to your trajectory. Build the reputation before you need it. Maintain it more carefully than any other asset you have. And understand that it is always either growing or eroding. There is no neutral position. The fifth principle was the response to disrespect, the deterrent strategy, the signal that there is no free shot here. At your scale, the deterrent is not necessarily a public counterattack. It is the consistent enforcement of your actual standards in the context where they are being tested. The salary that is below what you are worth and you address rather than absorb. The client who treats your time as if it is cheap and you correct rather than accommodate. The relationship that operates on terms that do not reflect your actual value and you renegotiate rather than accept as permanent. Every time you enforce a standard rather than absorbing a violation of it, you are sending the same signal Trump was sending. There is no free shot here. And over time, that signal accumulates into a reputation for being someone whose standards are real, whose limits are actual. whose value is not something that can be quietly renegotiated downward without consequence. Now let's talk about the foundational principle that underpins every other one we have covered. The one that Machiavelli returns to in almost every chapter of The Prince, and that Trump embodied more completely than almost any other figure in modern business. The refusal to accept the world's current assessment of your position as the permanent one. You have a current assessment of your own position. It was built from the evidence available to you. The financial situation you are in right now, the career trajectory you are on, the relationships you have, the opportunities you have access to, the constraints you are operating under. That assessment feels like reality because it is based on real evidence, and Machiavelli's most important instruction to you is to hold that assessment with one hand rather than both. Hold it with one hand because you need it. You need to know where you actually are. Clarity about the current position is the only foundation for doing anything useful about it. But only one hand, because the other hand needs to be free for the other thing, the permanent position you have decided on, the direction you are building toward. Most people grip the current assessment with both hands. They let it become the permanent one by default, because releasing even one hand from the current reality feels like recklessness or delusion. Machiavelli would tell you that the grip is the problem, not the assessment. The grip. The man who grips his current position with both hands cannot move toward a different one, because he has used all of his available grip on describing where he already is. Trump, in 1990, held the $900 million debt assessment with one hand, loosely, accurately, without pretending it was not real, and with the other hand he held the permanent position he had decided on. The story he was going to tell, the brand he was going to rebuild. The next chapter he had already started writing in his head while the current chapter was still being resolved by committees of bankers. That dual grip is the practice, the thing you develop over time by doing it repeatedly until it becomes the default mode rather than the deliberate choice. Here is how you start practicing it today. Write down your current assessment. Honestly, the actual financial position, the actual career situation, the actual state of the things that matter most to your trajectory right now. Not the hopeful version, not the catastrophized version. The accurate one. This is the hand you need to hold it with. One hand, clear-eyed, without drama. Then write the permanent position. Not a fantasy, a direction. The specific, honest, clearly defined thing that you are building toward. The financial position you have decided is what you are constructing. The professional standing you have decided is what you are developing. The life that your accumulated daily choices are supposed to be building toward. This is the other hand, the one that stays free to reach for the next thing. Now look at the gap between the two. Not with despair, with analytical clarity. What is the gap? What is the actual distance between where you are and where you have decided you are going? And what is one specific thing you can do today, not the whole journey, one step, that moves you toward the permanent position rather than deeper into the grip of the current one? That is the whole practice. Two hands, one assessment, one direction, one step. Trump did it with $900 million in debt. The scale of the current position you are dealing with is almost certainly more manageable than that, which means the distance to the permanent one is almost certainly shorter than the one he was navigating. And the principles that got him from there to here were written 500 years ago by a man who spent his life watching power move in the real world and documenting what he saw with a precision that 5 centuries of changing circumstances have not managed to make irrelevant. The Prince was written for Italian city-states. It applies to Manhattan real estate in the 1980s. It applies to the world's first trillionaire in 2026. And it applies to wherever you are right now, in whatever the specific version of broke, mocked, and written off looks like in your own life. Because the mechanics do not change. They have never changed. The technology changes. The industry changes. The scale changes. The specific circumstances that make each situation unique change completely. And underneath all of that change, the principles that determine who recovers and who does not, who builds something durable, and who builds something that collapses with the first serious reversal, who holds the permanent position while the current one resolves itself, and who confuses the current one for the permanent one and stays in it forever. Those principles are the same. They were the same when Machiavelli wrote them. They were the same when Trump applied them. They are the same right now in your life. Machiavelli ends The Prince with a call to action. He was writing to Lorenzo de' Medici, trying to get his attention, trying to make him see that the principles existed and that applying them could change everything. He wrote with urgency, with the specific frustration of a man who has understood something clearly and is watching the people around him fail to apply it. That urgency belongs here too. Not because your situation is as dramatic as the political fate of Renaissance Italy, because the cost of not applying what you understand is paid every single day in the gap between the life you are living and the one you have the capability to build. That cost is quiet. It does not arrive in a single catastrophic moment. It accumulates in the daily choice of the current position over the permanent one, in the negotiation not had, in the standard not held, in the brand not built, in the battlefield not changed, in the visibility not maintained, in the story not written. Every day those costs accumulate, and every day you understand the principles and choose to apply them, they reverse. Start with one, the one that landed hardest in this video, the one that you already know, as you sit here right now. Connects most directly to something in your own situation that needs to change. Pick that one. Apply it today. Not perfectly. Specifically, in one concrete action that is different from what you would have done before you watched this video. That is the beginning, and the beginning is always available, regardless of the current position, regardless of the assessment, regardless of what the consensus around you has decided about your trajectory. The prince decides for himself. That is the whole point of the prince. The sovereignty over your own assessment. The refusal to outsource the permanent position to people who are only looking at the current one. You have that sovereignty. You have always had it. The principles to exercise it have been available for 500 years. What you do with them from this moment forward is yours entirely. If this video changed how you see the connection between a 500-year-old strategy and one of the most studied business comebacks in modern history, subscribe, share it with one person who is currently in a position that looks permanent but is not. Drop a comment with the principle that hit hardest. Not for the engagement, because the person who reads that comment next week might be exactly where you were at the start of this video, and your specific honest response might be the thing that helps them pick up the right hand and let go of the current position long enough to reach for the permanent one. The prince gave the strategy. Trump proved the strategy works. What you build with it is the part that has not been written yet. Start writing it now.